This is the Content Analysis Assignment number 3, A Historical Timeline by Peyton Strauss. Today we will be identifying 10 important events that have impacted the education of English language learners. These different events will take place in 1954, 1964, 1965, 1968, 1974, 1974, 1978, 1981, 1981, and 2002. Our first important event is Brown v. Board of Education. This was signed on May 17, 1954. It was signed by the Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren. Brown v. Board of Education was a landmark case in which the justices ruled that racial segregation of children in public places was unconstitutional and illegal. Brown v. Board helped establish the example that separate but equal education and other services were in fact not equal. Another event was the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act was signed on July 2, 1964. It was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 said that segregation on the grounds of race, religion, or national origin were banned at all places of public accommodation, including courthouses, parks, restaurants, theaters, sports arenas, schools, and hotels. If discrimination did happen, the federal funds were discontinued or legal action would be taken with the Department of Justice. This is the Civil Rights Act. The next event is the Elementary and Second Education Act. This was signed on April 11, 1965. It was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The Elementary and Second Education Act of 1965 had three main key components. The first component was the funds. The second component was the policies. And the third component were the procedures that target students. This act also came with a higher accountability level and a higher standards level. This is the Elementary and Second Education Act. The next thing that took place was the Bilingual Education Act. This act was signed on January 2, 1968. This act was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The Bilingual Education Act provided funding for schools to support bilingual education programs. These fundings were provided by grants. This act began the outlay of states creating statutes that allowed for home language instruction to happen. Another event that happened was Lau v. Nichols. This decision was issued on January 21, 1974. Lau v. Nichols gave notice to the fact that by giving the same materials that English speakers have to English language learners does not make it easy for students to learn. Accommodations and materials are needed for English language learners. This case came to be by a group of Chinese students who were put into a class that taught using English, even though these students had limited English proficiency. The result of this was that districts were required to have a program for English language learners so they could be successful. This is Lau v. Nichols, and it happened in 1974. Next is Cerna v. Pertels. This issue was decided on July 17th, 1974. It was focused on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and was the first case to raise awareness to the issue of bilingual education outside of the context of desegregation. This case enforced schools having a bilingual curriculum, with this required having to hire bilingual teachers to teach the bilingual curriculum. This case came to be because a school in New Mexico, consisting of mostly white students, was not providing a good enough bilingual program for Spanish students. Because of this, schools are being enforced to have bilingual curriculum and are having to take the steps to hire bilingual teachers and make a program for non-white students to succeed. Next is Rios versus Reed. This decision was issued on October 13th, 1978. Rios versus Reed was a case about the attention being brought by parents that schools were calling themselves to have bilingual education programs, but did not actually have bilingual education programs. There were no clear bilingual curriculum present. This case changed that a required guideline for what a bilingual classroom needed to be. So it gave an outline of what schools needed to have to consider a bilingual classroom, and all schools were required to have bilingual classrooms. This is Rios versus Reed, and it happened in 1978. Next is Castaneda versus Pickard. This decision was issued on June 23, 1981. Castaneda versus Pickard came from Raymondville ISD, failing to meet the students' needs of English language learner students as they should be. This resulted in schools being required to show results in order to prove that improvement was happening. These results were to be shown through a three-part test. The first part was theory, based on educational theory. They had to show what they were teaching and the theory behind it. The second part was practice. The schools must implement the program and make the theory become reality. So they have to put the theory into play and not just say that the theory's there, but they have to show how they're making it happen, turning something into reality. The third part of this test is the results. The program must be evaluated to see if it is succeeding in helping English language learners overcome struggles based on language. So are English language learners succeeding? Are they getting better at what they're doing? That is part of the assessment and test that schools are given because of Castaneda versus Pickard, and this happened in 1981. Next is the United States versus Texas. The United States versus Texas included mandating for all Texas schools. An order was directed that all schools must establish a plan and implement language programs that would assist Mexican Americans to learn English and adjust to the American culture. So all schools are being mandated because of United States versus Texas, and they all must have a plan and implement it for students to succeed. This happened in 1981. And the last one we're going to cover today happened in 2002, and it was the No Child Left Behind. It was signed on January 8th, 2002. It was signed by President George W. Bush, No Child Left Behind was an accountability source for schools and students' outcomes. Federal involvement increased education due to this act, so there was more federal involvement in the world of education because of No Child Left Behind. The word bilingual was removed. This allowed for a new image of students. An increase of fundings were provided for bilingual programs in schools. So there's a wider range of accountability, a wider range of involvement, a new look on students because they are not defined by the word bilingual, and there was an increase in fundings for bilingual programs to succeed. These are my references from the information that I got.